Good Yontif. I don't know about you, but living through COVID feels like I've been living in a cave. We are all cut off, isolated. So many of us are lonely. We are suffering emotionally, physically, economically, and spiritually. Many in our community have commented to me that they are wrestling with depression. It is no surprise. So many of us have lost our jobs, our health, our vitality, our get up and go, because quite honestly, there's nowhere to go. I had planned on visiting my mother and her husband in Portland, Oregon, but chose not to fly there because of COVID. She and Byron were hoping to fly here for the holidays, but they won't be coming. With tears in her eyes, my mom worries that she may never come east again to see her family. And this past May, Lori's mother, Audrey, Zichrona Livracha, passed away from COVID. What made matters worse is that we were unable to visit her at the Abramson Center, comfort her, or even say goodbye to her. All we had were a few FaceTime conversations that were scheduled from time to time. These are horrible, unprecedented times in American history. We are dying, we are suffering, we are losing work, we are running deficits, fighting depression, closing businesses. And worst, we see American streets overflowing with rage and violence and death. So what do? COVID has struck us all differently. Not everyone is experiencing the pandemic the same way. For some people, I don't know why, the journey is smooth. For others, I don't know why the journey is rough. For some, I don't know why the virus takes a person's life. And for others, I don't know why the virus has almost no impact at all. This is a disease with no clear symptoms, but the effects on our psyche are all too clear. Now, in searching for wisdom to share with you about this response to COVID, I found an amazing story in the Talmud, Tractate Shabbat, about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. As it turns out, Shimon Bar Yochai disparaged a Roman emperor in the first century, and he was sentenced to death by tribunal. He and his son went to hide in a schoolhouse briefly, but realized they weren't safe there, so then they went and found a cave and hid there for 12 years, waiting for the emperor to die and waiting for the decree to be annulled. They made a life for themselves in the cave. They found the best they could. The text tells us, so Rabbi Shimon went with his son and hid in a cave, and a miracle happened. A carob tree and a spring of water were created for them. And all day they studied and sat, and when the time came to pray, they covered their heads and they prayed. Finally, after 12 years, the story tells us, Elijah the prophet came to the opening of the cave to tell Yochai that the emperor had died and that the decree was annulled. So they went out, and they saw immediately men plowing and sowing in a field, and Reb Shimon was enraged. He said, unlike us, who for 12 years devoted ourselves to eternal life, these people are busying themselves with meaningless things like food. And so with a kind of a mythical power, he burned them up with his gaze, kind of like Superman. The text tells us every place to which he looked, everything turned to a cinder. Finally, a heavenly voice, a voice from God, a bat kol, the text tells us, came out and said to the rabbi, did you come out of the cave after 12 years of faith and study and prayer only to destroy my world? Go back into the cave. And so they returned. Another 12 years. They came out again, but this time they were different. Text tells us that they had hope, kindness, forbearance. The text says, and I quote, wherever his son Rabbi Elazar smote, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai healed. Later, his colleagues see the toll that this isolation had brought on him. His body and his character were weakened, but he was wiser. He said to his colleagues, blessed are you who see me so. for you can tell just how much I have learned in my loneliness. Before his isolation, he had some answers, but now he had even more. I feel like Rabbi Yochai. So do you. We were quarantined and we waited for the curve to flatten, and the curve flattened. And we came out of our caves. And then COVID cases started to rise and we had to go back into our isolation. But like Shimon Bar Yochai, I believe that we have come out wiser. Here's what I've learned. Being good, being nice, being frum, going to shul, doing mitzvot, supporting Israel, praying devoutly, keeping kosher, supporting the synagogue tzedakah funds, all of these are good and praiseworthy, and they should be done. But none of these are any guarantee that catastrophe and calamity won't happen to us. You see, Shimon was pious, and yet look at all the tsuras he had. He was alone, dejected, and hunted. I know this. Religion is not an umbrella. It is not an insurance policy against distress. That is not its purpose. If it were, we would all be religious, not out of piety, but out of prudence. But COVID has tested us like no other experience I can remember in recent years. It kicks out from under us the social stilts on which we stand and rubs off the veneer of invulnerability we habitually wear. It has held up a mirror for us to see ourselves more clearly, and in our fearful encounter with it, we are compelled to see who and what we truly are. We like to think of ourselves as strong and independent, but we don't like to admit it, oh so vulnerable. Allow me to share with you a few precious insights from this story of Shimon Bar Yochai in the cave. He was enraged, couldn't get a handle on why life had treated him so unfairly. At first, he couldn't stop his anger from destroying everything around him. He literally burnt everything up. So God says to him, go back into the cave and think. Look at your life and that of others, but do so with new eyes, ones that won't burn the world up. In other words, look at your problems with clear and open eyes. Gain some perspective, because perspective is everything. We need to understand that there are situations we can solve and there are situations we cannot. And I have met so many people who, when confronted by trouble, respond with despair. They cannot see a way out. And I've also been fortunate enough to meet people who have an unbelievable fighting spirit, and they confront the solvable problems with resolve. Do you remember the serenity prayer? God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the strength to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. When we can effect a change, we must put our shoulder to the wheel. But let us also accept with resolution that not all problems can be solved. We just have to endure so that our pain softens. Perspective is essential. For to confuse what we can change with what we cannot change only leads to more pain, more suffering, more rage. Second, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai found support from his son. In times of trouble, we must find strength from one another, even if we cannot be in their physical presence. I doubt that he would have survived in that cave for 12 years alone. Could you imagine? We cannot survive alone. We too need to remember that alone we are so much more vulnerable. Even if you are living alone, and I know that there are members of this congregation who are, there are people that care for you. and need you. For many of us, it may be a wife, or it may be a husband, it might be a friend, or it might even be a child. But we must make sure that during this time of cave dwelling, we do not stay isolated, but that we reach out and connect. We can turn to someone else, someone who will listen patiently and caring to our problems, someone who will hear us out, and more important, we can listen to them and support them in their distress. For as we lift them up, we ourselves are so often lifted. One of the greatest Jewish theologians, Franz Rosenzweig, believed that none of us stand on solid ground. Each of us are actually held up by our neighbor's hands. Who knows? Our family might have a suggestion to offer that we never thought of. Our families might be able to lead us to someone who can help, perhaps a doctor, a lawyer, a business person, or some wise individual. And even if he or she cannot, just being listened to will do some good. The Talmud teaches when two students listen patiently to one another, the Holy One listens to them too. And if they do not listen and do not care for one another, they cause the Shekhinah, the indwelling presence of God, to depart from Israel. My friend, concealed grief are the most consuming. Secret maladies are the most fatal. Third, Shimon was furious with his circumstances. He was angry at being isolated, and so, as I told you, he lashed out. And we do that too, don't we? We grow impatient, angry, unable to listen and find patience. So God sent Shimon back into the cave. And I think that was his way of saying, you can endure a little longer. Get a hold of yourself. Harriet Beecher Stowe once wrote, when you get in a tight place and everything goes against you till it seems that you cannot hold on another minute, never give up, for that's just the place and the time when the tide will turn. In my first congregation in Florida, I met a member of our shul who told me of a terrible night in Auschwitz, and I have never forgotten the story, and from time to time I remember it. It was a typical night of torture. The inmates were forced to stand in tattered clothes for a torturous 36 hours at attention in the middle of winter. And anyone that fell to the ground would be immediately shot. People's limbs began to freeze, and with little strength left, inmates began to waver and teeter. To prevent anyone from being killed, hands were quietly and surreptitiously stretched out to support the weak. And like electricity, a German word, aushalten, which means hold on, coursed up and down the ranks. This desperate cry, aushalten, hold on, gave the weak the strength to endure. It was as if God's hands, I was told, were supporting them. My friends, we can always hold on a little longer. And if you do, as Harriet Beecher Stowe once said, you will never know when the winds will shift and the sun will come out. My greatest hero was Winston Churchill, who said during the darkest moments of history, during World War II, never give up. Never give up. Never give up. I listen to his voice on the radio, and it moves me when I hear it. And finally, we can turn to our heritage for help. Now, I don't believe for a second that God will solve all our problems for us, but I do believe that a faith in God can give us the strength to confront our tsuris. When we turn to our traditions, we tap into resources that the non-believer can avail. Our true personality is like a larger submerged section of an iceberg that never fully appears above the surface. In all of us, there is a child, a mystic, a poet, an ethicist, a prophet in all of us. And too often that side of us is either ignored or forgotten by the material and competitive world of ours. But our faith often through worship, elicits the healing side of our personality. Prayer enables us to reach into the depths of our core and our spirits, a core that is untouched by normal experiences, and brings to our consciousness the mystic, the beautiful, the just, the aesthetic, the healing, and the affectionate capacities that reside deep within us. We will find emotional support in our prayer. We will discover a connectedness to others and to God in our prayer, and we will find a new perspective which empowers and strengthens us to fight one more day. Our prayer book says it best: the one who rises from prayer a stronger person, their prayers have been answered. Don't forget to pray. These then are the four things we can do when we find ourselves in the cave. We can look at our problems as if there is something we can do about them. We can turn to a friend for help. We can hang on a little longer, and we can turn to our heritage. One last lesson. At the conclusion of the story of Shimon Bar Yochai and the cave, after he came out from his second term, 24 years in a cave, he says something remarkable. It's almost a throwaway sentence. Amar ho'il hitrachesh li nes, elech ve'etaken devar. Since a miracle occurred for me, I'm alive, I will go and fix something. We are here. We may not be together, but we are here, and we are alive. And that is a wondrous thing. He turned his pain and his suffering and his travail into a moment where he could express himself with gratitude by helping another person. He chose not to turn inward and focus on his path, but rather, like a true sage, he turned and lifted up another. Elech ve'etaken devar. I will go and I will fix it. As we find ourselves still in the cave, so to speak, let us resolve to lift up the fallen. Let us resolve to heal the sick. Let us resolve to comfort the bereaved. Let us resolve to find the good. And when things are broken, and God knows they are, may we do one simple thing: fix them. Good Yontif.